I'd like to ask the Minister for Policy and Reform what research has been undertaken on the 15% property vacancy rate shown in the 2016 census, which equates to 6,470 empty homes.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Perhaps you could give me an indication with your arms about the volume and about the speed if you need me to change.
Standing orders, yes, do refer to 3 minutes maximum for a reply, otherwise please circulate in advance.
Through the 2016
But
census...
I leave it entirely to you to follow your own good sense without the need of my intervention.
Through the 2016 census, we do know the addresses of all of the properties which were vacant on census night. As the honourable member will appreciate, discovering why all of those properties were vacant is relatively difficult, as contacting the owners is self-evidently not a straightforward process. However, Cabinet Office has been working with the MUA to look to see whether it is possible to identify a pattern of occupation through electricity consumption. This will help to identify whether a property has been permanently occupied since the census, remains vacant, or is occupied part of the year, but not at other parts of the year, because censuses always happen in April. This work was first conducted in October 2018 and is being repeated in July 2019, winter, autumn, summer, so that any patterns of occupation might be noticed. This information, plus information from reviewing the vacant property data set, will be published in time for consideration by the public inquiry into the area plan for the East.
Supplementary, Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. President. It sounds that real limited progress has been made in investigating this matter. The 2016 census also showed that there were 2,430 empty properties in Douglas. That is a staggering 21% vacancy rate. The vacancy rate on the island is much higher than the figure in the UK of 4% and in Jersey of 7%. What policies is the Minister for Policy and Reform bringing forward to tackle the more than 1 in 5 empty properties in Douglas?
Minister.
Definition is very important, and the Treasury member will, I'm sure, understand definition. And the 4% vacancy rate in the UK is definitely a different definition from the Isle of Man one. I'm sure he's well aware of that. And if not, I'll have to circulate some more information to him. The Jersey 7% is defined in a different way. Now, the issue is that we've always had 14 or 15% vacancy factor in the Isle of Man in recent decade. And we know that from the previous census. And in fact, from the census going back into the previous decade. So we have a massive issue. It could just be that we're a great place
We agree on that.
to have a house. It could just be that there are lots of rooms which are separate for census purposes in bigger places that are now under-occupied. We will know categorically more than we know now once we've interrogated the electricity consumption and all the other factors that we can bring to this. We will know at the end of the smart service framework much more about every property, because we're not only looking at individuals inside the smart service framework, we've also got a project to do it for properties. In terms of policies to address this, now, it might be that we need loads more green fields to deal with this, because it might be that all those properties are permanently unoccupiable, in which case we need more green fields because they can never be brought back into occupation, but I don't think so. It might be that we have to knock down substantial parts of Douglas to actually deal with this, but I don't think so. But I'm preempting the question. What I'm firmly of the view is that we need evidence base before we come up with policy responses. And what I'm actually saying to you today is this situation has persisted for an awful long time. We don't need cheap points about vacancy rate. We actually need substantial positive policies about planning. We need substantial positive policies about housing. We need substantial policies about making sure that people have the right incomes inside the Isle of Man to renovate these properties if that's what's needed. With that, Mr. President, I beg to sit down.
Mr. Henderson.
I'd very much appreciate the Chief Ashok's answer in terms of not being sarcastic to this important question. And he asked for evidence. Will he agree with me that he will do some research with our housing colleagues in DOI back to 2000, where this honourable member moved a motion here, Empty Properties, Vacant Properties Initiative, to address exactly the same situation as the honourable member in Middle's referring to? And will he find out what happened to the Empty Properties officer that was engaged, who is on government boards currently, and the report she produced with all the evidence therein, and use that as a baseline to assist the honourable member for Middle in his genuine quest for answers here? And will he further agree that if you discount half the properties in the percentage figures that are presented, we will have substantial amounts of vacant properties that could be brought online, especially, as I found in 2000, empty private properties for no apparent reason, just lying, and empty local authority housing stock, empty for extensive periods of time due to an inadequate maintenance regime and other problems that the local authority was experiencing. And we could have brought that percentage down. Would he agree to examine all of that, bring it into his equation, which would assist the honourable member for Middle?
Minister.
Yes. And the first point is I really, really appreciate the wisdom of my honourable friend from the upper shelf, because in that question he's confirmed that this is a persistent, perennial problem that we need to tackle. And this administration and this Tynwald Court is into tackling persistent problems. So the first thing I heard was that this problem was there in 2000 and it's still there. The second point, you made some very positive suggestions, and the local authority empty vacancy stock is much lower than it ever was, and questions have been asked about that persistently, and we've done everything we can from the housing division to work with local authorities and the other housing authorities to bring those stocks into existence. And in terms of the private sector, I think we're now this Honourable Court hasn't seen the third version as yet, but with Mr President's leave I'll refer to it. We've already seen two specific recommendations for the use of things like rates on dilapidated properties as a bit of a stick to encourage the private sector to start using. We had that recommendation in the planning review consultation response documentation. We had that recommendation in the excellent Tynwald Select Committee on brownfield sites and property, which was put together,
which you watered down.
Forthcoming rates consultation response document, which is about to be considered for discussion soon, will also include that recommendation, because that's in line with the public thing. So that's a very specific property. We do need to make sure, especially given that this issue corresponds with two others identified in this court as being important, the one of climate change and energy efficiency, and the one of conservation areas and historic building registration. We very much do need to revisit all of our policies towards using perhaps public money, but certainly encouraging the use of private money to make sure we use of our existing housing stock. That's not easy. If it was easy, the last administration would have done it. It's difficult. This administration and this court is up to big challenges, and we will tackle it, or at least we'll lay the grounds for it to be tackled in the coming years.
Honourable Member Mr Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr President. Is the more than 1 in 5 home vacancy rate in Douglas a cheap point or a massive issue? I know what it is. I'm surprised that the Minister for Policy and Reform has any difficulty recognising it. The vacancy rate in Douglas, of course, was not actually disclosed in the 2016 census. It was provided following a specific request to the Head of Economic Affairs. Will the Minister circulate the vacancy rates for all of our towns on the island, so that those outside of the Cabinet Office, who may well have an interest in this, who may well be concerned about this, can understand the extent of the scale of the hollowing out of the towns on the Isle of Man following consistent poor planning policy?
Minister.
Thank you very much. It wasn't a cheap point. This honourable member who represents Douglas has always had in his manifestos going back to 2011 the fact that we've got to deal with the vacant property and the dilapidated property, but that's using too technical a word, the basically poor state of some of Douglas's older housing stock. I forgot to mention one other point in this, which is the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture has initiated a housing conditions survey, but for some reason it's been harder to complete in terms of getting it proper access than was first thought, and it's work in progress still. But that will be a very helpful input, like we had back in the 2000s. So I can categorically assure the honourable questioner that my point wasn't that this is not an issue that needs, not even a challenge that needs to be addressed. My point was, as the honourable questioner well knows, the definition is at the heart of this, and being vacant on census night is not the same as being a house that you can move into with your kids in a few weeks' time. The second point is, of course, any further information from censuses is available. It's quite clear in census information that any information for it to be broken down further will be provided, as long as that request is reasonable and possible and can be accommodated within the time. So I can circulate breakdowns as much as possible, but it would be helpful. And the honourable member would also, I'm sure, like to know that the full data under things like the residential land availability study and the brownfield sites data is constantly updated and monitored and will be available for the inquiry this year.
Honourable Member for Aaron Michael, Mr Baker.
Thank you, Mr President. Would the Honourable Minister acknowledge that actually this is a very, very important subject, which isn't just applicable in the Isle of Man context, but is actually very applicable in many other areas of the British Isles, and draws attention to the challenges of some of the attractive rural and seaside towns across areas of the British Isles, and Cornwall in particular and parts of Wales come to mind, where one of the biggest issues facing local authorities is around the impact of holiday homes and absentee owners, which have effectively mean that there's no life in lots of those areas in many times of the year. And will the Minister actually undertake to look at this in a considered way? Because we've got some specific factors perhaps around the structure of our island, the economy, maybe some of the financial incentives, and that we really do need to understand this in two really important policy areas, one being our strategy in terms of building new homes, but also in terms of our regeneration of town centres, and that it isn't just about looking at our island, but we need to look in a wider context as well.
Very much nailed it, as always. I thank the honourable member for Aaron Michael for that very pertinent observation through question. So, rural seaside towns, holiday homes, absent owners is completely relevant. The vacant property project has been underway for some years, in fact, and it has intensified. Further to my question about it, 4 years ago, Mr. Robert Shaw initiated it, and I've been pursuing it. But there's only a small group of people in economic affairs, and it's coming to the head for the planning inquiry. There's not a lot wrong with planning. Planning is pretty encompassing. As the honourable questioner knows, this is about policies on housing, this is about policies on rating, this is about on treasury incentives for different types of development. Planning is enabling, and that's the objective of enabling. Just to give some fresh information to help the debate along, the other part of the Isle of Man where there's a huge number of people who didn't fill in the census returns is in Ramsey, the second largest town. There were 727 properties in Ramsey that were vacant on census night. So it's not just a Douglas issue. This is an issue down north or up north or whatever it is in terms of property in the town. So there's also an issue in the countryside. The conclusion of the last housing conditions survey was that we do have a substantial number of substandard pieces of accommodation in rural areas. The vacant property work is vitally important, and it will lead to some major changes, I hope, in terms of certain policies, and looking forward to working with this Honourable Court as government to take those forward.
Mr Henderson.
Would the Taoiseach agree, because I don't think he did in responding to me in the last supplementary, to dig out the empty property, vacant properties Hansard debate from here, dig out the report that was eventually done, and would he agree with me, Actor, that upon his research work, he'll find that the reason he expresses difficulty not that the department found it difficult, the department found it difficult to energise and initiate anything in the first place. That was the problem, the motivation actor. And if he'd look into that, that was a real issue. And the report that was subsequent upon that by a senior official who sits on government committees currently, which will inform him of his direction of travel for the plan, which will in itself, if he could agree, will provide the space and opportunities on brownfield sites, which, if he'll agree further, will ultimately take the pressure off the greenfield issue.
Minister.
Thank you. And as the honourable questioner will know, because he's so diligent, 40% of the proposed houses in the area plan for the East are on brownfield sites. But I agree completely that it's worth going back and looking at that debate in 2000, and I will do that on Hansard. And what's more, I promise that the recommendations in that report, once that's located, will actually be referenced in the vacancy report, which is just being finalised at the moment.
Final supplementary, Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Minister agree that if we take the potential that is in our brownfield sites and the 6,500 empty homes on the island, that now is the time to refocus development on our town centres?
Thank you, Mr. President. The strategic plan, which has been policy since 2006, and in fact it was policy before that, has always focused development on brownfield sites and previously developed land. Simple to look at, in fact, one of the earliest, if not the first policy in the strategic plan will confirm that. Very, very pleased that the report was helpful there, which uncovered that. This is not a planning issue. This is a much more important structural issue about why those houses are vacant and why certain policies are in place in the Isle of Man that need to be challenged.